QSO Today, episode 328, Ralph Holler, N4RH. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver and their new ID52A dual-band portable. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. As we are now preparing for the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, coming in March 2021, I want to announce that Flex Radio will be one of the two platinum sponsors of the Expo. I also want to thank Elecraft and Connect Systems for taking the first 2 of 8 gold sponsorships in the Expo. These sponsorships are important as they allow me and the Expo team to work almost full-time to make the next Expo a huge success. Last June, I think it was, I was contacted by Dan Beaver, KA4DAN, who politely reminded me that our amateur radio community included blind and vision-impaired hams, and that they should not be overlooked in the Expo. He was right, of course. It didn't even cross my mind. We were heading full speed to the Expo on a platform that for sighted folks was amazing, but for blind folks was less than useful. This is why I created a screen reader compatible web page with all of the speaker presentations available to the blind community even before the Expo opened. I even embedded a screen reader link at the top of the Expo homepage that was the same color as the background so that it could be found easily by screen readers and ignored by the rest of the hams coming to the website. User accessibility is a priority for us here at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. I reached out to Dr. Ronald Milliman, K8HSY, my guest in episode 32 back in 2015, also a blind ham, to help me better understand the needs of blind and vision-impaired hams. We did not have time before the last Expo to fully understand and implement any suggestions for making the last Expo more blind user-friendly. Ron generously volunteered a team to audit the next Expo platform to ensure that our Expo was screen reader compatible. Ron assembled a team of blind hams who audited our upgraded platform and sent me a detailed report last week. We passed with flying colors except for a few changes that we have already submitted to our platform provider. I want to thank Ron, K8HSY, and the following individuals for taking on this project with us and sending us the results. This team included Dan Beaver, KA4DAN, Stephen Clower, AC9XS, Sarah Alawami, KE7ZUM, John Mule, KA1JFJ, and Chris Smart, VE3RWJ. Ralph Holler, N4RH, started his ham radio journey as a 9-year-old with a knack for electronics, leading to his first amateur radio license. Within a few years, Ralph earned broadcast engineering licenses, radio station jobs, an education, and finally a career at the Federal Communications Commission. N4RH was a driving force behind many of the FCC initiatives that have had a lasting impact on radio amateurs in the USA and around the world. N4RH is my QSO Today. N4RH, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Ralph?
Hi, Eric. It's Ralph. Yes, I am.
Ralph, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
That's a little bit of a difficult question. I have to say I had an interest in radio back probably even before going to school. My folks used to tell me that they couldn't keep me away from electronic things. I would take flashlights apart and move Christmas tree lights from one plug to another, and sort of anything that had to do with the electricity had my attention. And then when I was about 8 years old, I met a ham radio operator. His name was Orville Strempel, W0UPU, now a silent key, but went over to his house, and he fired up the rig, and we talked to a number of stations, and I thought, this is pretty neat. So that led to me getting a novice license in 1959, and ultimately upgrading to extra, and I've been licensed ever since.
Did Orville give you the test at that time, the first test?
No. Actually, the test was given, I took a course that was given by the local radio club to get the novice license, and the instructor of that course is the one that actually gave me the test.
I see. And what was the hometown?
Topeka, Kansas.
And the radio club?
Kaw Valley Radio Club.
Kaw Valley, like K-A-W?
K-A-W, yeah. It's there's a river that flows through Kansas called the Kaw River, and so the club was named after that.
And how old were you in 1959 when you got your novice license?
I was 9.
Wow, that's actually, for those days, that was pretty young, I think.
Yeah, like I say, I was really interested from an early age. It was fascinating and got my attention.
Do you remember what your first call sign was?
KN0YMA.
I think in those days it was good for a year.
It was good for a year, and then I tried upgrading to general, and in those days you had to go to the FCC office to do that, which was, for me, Kansas City. Took the test, and the first time I took it, I failed the code, and the second time I took it, I passed the code and failed the written, and the third time I took it, I finally passed it and got my general.
And that was within that year period of time?
Actually, it started in that year, and ultimately, by the time I got the general, it was like 6 months after the novice had expired. So I guess technically I haven't been licensed continuously, but I tried to be.
No, but technically you were 10 years old when you got your general.
That's true, yes.
That's very impressive, because I think in those days I remember taking the general at 16 years of age, and it was pretty hard.
Well, I went on, and as soon as I got the general class, there was no advanced in those days. It was general to extra. But I didn't go that route. I then started on my commercial licenses and got my third-class commercial license, radio telephone license, when I was 12, upgraded then to second class, and got my first-class radio telephone license when I was 13.
So you have a first-class radio telephone license at age 13. Were you needed in Topeka, Kansas by any of the radio stations there to be their engineer or to at least sign logs?
In fact, I became an engineer at one of the local radio stations when I was 14, still in high school. Worked there part-time as a transmitter engineer, ultimately a combination engineer disc jockey. Then when I left for college, I went to a different station. I went to the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas, and became chief engineer of the local commercial station there, KLWN. Did that for 2 years, and then went back to KEWI in Topeka as chief engineer. Spent the rest of my time working my way through college as chief engineer of that station, and then did broadcast consulting for a while, built a few stations around the country, and ultimately went to work for the FCC in late 1970.
Here you are, age 9 as a novice, and then age 10 as a general. It sounds to me like your parents were quite supportive of your efforts to become a radio amateur, even taking you to Kansas City to get your license exams. What was their attitude?
Well, supportive is the right answer. They thought that it was a good thing for me to get involved with. Frankly, by the time I was 9, I had already made the decision. I'll come back to this, but I'd already made the decision that my career was going to be as an electrical engineer. And they thought that this was a good opportunity for me to get some experience, and also to, because of the radio club, to get to know people who were working as engineers and technicians in radio and television mostly. And so they thought it was excellent for me to start getting involved in these kinds of activities at that age, given what I thought I wanted to do with my life.
This was kind of the age of Sputnik as well, right? So that there was a lot of excitement about radio in those days?
Absolutely. I had my receiver, and I tuned it in and listened to it.
Okay, so what was the first rig as a novice?
I had a Hallicrafters S85 receiver that my folks bought for me, and I built a novice transmitter out of the ARRL handbook as I recall, it was 3 tubes, and build it and put it on the air. And my whole novice career, I made 2 contacts. The first contact that I made was with the FCC monitoring station in Grand Island, Nebraska for second harmonic radiation. I was on 80 meters, but they heard me a little above 40. And my second contact was with an ARRL official observer in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Same situation. I turned the transmitter off and did not turn it back on.
But still you weren't discouraged, and you went on to get your general class license.
Absolutely, yeah. It didn't discourage me, although I was concerned about going to jail if I kept the transmitter operational.
So you upgrade to general a year later. Did the rig improve at that point?
Yes. At that time, again, my folks were supportive, and they got a Viking Valiant transmitter, which was a CWAM transmitter, about 200 watts, and so I had that, and I never received any more violations, so it was probably a good thing to quit using the one I made.
And were you active on the air, and were you on CW or phone?
I was on both, and yes, I was active on the air. There was a group of teenagers that started a 40-meter net that we met every Saturday morning. I checked into that regularly. Some evenings after school, we would get together and talk. And I was also active in the local radio club, very active on 2 meters. The 2-meter activity originally in town was basically simplex with converted commercial equipment that had been taken out of service because the commercial equipment had to be narrow-banded from 25 to 15 kilohertz deviation. So there was a lot of commercial equipment available, and then we eventually got a repeater in town, and I was active in that. So yes, during most of that time, I was pretty active.
This goes to my early interest in commercial equipment as well. Do you remember what your 2-meter rig was?
The first one was a Motorola 80D, which was actually 2 separate units, transmitter and receiver separate, that hooked together with big cables, and the transmitter had a dynamotor in it. So when you had it in the car, you used it and pressed the button, the headlights dimmed. But it worked, and I got it on the air, and then eventually got an RCA unit, and it was surplused from the railroads. Topeka was actually the headquarters of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. One of the people in the club was with the railroad, and he was able to get most of us in the club some of this surplus equipment that they couldn't use anymore at a very reasonable price. So I got that and had a couple of units on the air. Then I used the 80D as a base station and used the RCA as a mobile. Continued using that actually for several years.
Yeah, I love that stuff. I love the smell of that stuff. I'm a little younger than you, so I remember the Motorola T-Powers, the GGTs, things like that.
Well, the interesting thing about the 80Ds is they had Lochtel tubes, which were pretty interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They had little tiny pins. They looked like a regular octal tube, except it was smaller pins. And when you pressed them into the socket, they really snapped in. And I guess they were made because they were concerned in a mobile environment that if they didn't have that, the tubes would fall out with the vibration. That was the only reason I could figure why they made them. But it was interesting units, and certainly gave me a lot of experience in terms of converting them from the commercial frequencies down to the amateur frequencies, getting them on the air. So a lot of my interest in amateur radio has really been more on the technical side, learning about electronics more so than communications. It's okay to talk, and I don't have any problem with that, but my real interest has always been more on the technical side of it.
I understand that completely. I think that's what I do as well. Let me ask you, as a 14-year-old first-class radio telephone licensee and engineer at a radio station, how were you regarded by adults who were your peers at the radio station as a young engineer there?
I was rather fortunate in that the station that I worked at was a top 40 station, and the majority of the people working there were relatively young. Certainly, there were only a few people that were over 30. The owner, one of the engineers. Most of the other engineers were actually college students that were going to the University of Kansas and working at the radio station on a part-time basis. So it's not like I was working, I was 14 and working with a group of 50-year-olds. I was working with a group of 20-year-olds for the most part, 18 to 25 for the most part. So it's not like I was that much different in age, and I certainly never felt that there was any kind of animosity about my age and my working there. I was accepted and enjoyed it.
Now, you received a degree from the University of Kansas?
Yes, Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering.
And did you go on for advanced degrees after that?
I did some work towards an advanced degree, but actually I never completed an advanced degree.
And now this message from ICOM America. Ham for the holidays. ICOM's new ID52A and IC705 give hours of fun and enjoyment working your favorite bands this holiday season. ICOM's newest handheld amateur radio is the ID52A. The ID52A is a larger radio with a larger color display and louder audio. This VHF-UHF digital transceiver is much more than a replacement for the ID51A, but it also is a new way of communicating. The color display is 2.3 inches for exceptional viewability, and the audio is 80% louder. This multifunction dual-band D-Star transceiver supports DR mode for easy access to local repeaters based on internal GPS information as well as terminal access point modes. The ID52A has Bluetooth for audio and data control, providing improved mobility and control. And for the first time in amateur radio industry, you can now send photos from a connected Android device. Other features include wideband receiver with guaranteed ranges of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz. It has a VV, UU, VU, and dual DV mode. Integrated GPS receiver, including grid square location. Micro SD card slot. Micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging. And it's IPX7 waterproof. The ID52A is the perfect companion to the IC705. Both use compatible batteries and headsets, and you can also use the same Android app for D-Store operation. The IC705 is the perfect sidekick to the ID52A for hams that like to enjoy what both the great indoors and outdoors have to offer. This is the perfect QRP companion, base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. Other features include 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall, 5 watts out with a BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts with 13.8 volts DC supplied. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Touchscreen display, micro USB connector, Bluetooth, and wireless LAN. Integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot. Speaker microphone, the HM243 comes standard. Supports QRP and QRPP operations. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is, of course, the optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your IC705 and room for accessories for soda activations or a day of social distancing in the park. The IC705 is now shipping. Follow the link in the ICOM banner ad in this week's show notes, or go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur for more information on these fine rigs. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO. You mentioned earlier that you ended up at the FCC. How did you begin at the FCC?
Well, it was a little bit by accident. After I left the radio station as chief engineer, I went to work for a broadcast consultant in town, and we built radio stations, mostly in the Midwest, and also did maintenance on them. And one of the things we had to do in those days, when you were going to put a new station on the air, you actually had to go to the FCC field office, and you had to identify any other FCC licensed facility within 2 miles of your proposed location. And so I was at the Kansas City FCC office one day, and I was going through, in those days it was actually note cards, to try and locate other stations for a new station we were putting on. And the engineer in charge there, who I got to know, who, by the way, is the person who failed me in my first ham exam. But I got to know him quite well, actually. He came in and said, we're hiring right now. Have you ever thought of possibly working for the FCC? And I said, well, not really. I hadn't ever really thought about it. And he said, well, why don't you fill out this application? And we'll just send it in, and maybe they'll want to hire you. And I recommend working for the FCC. I've been here several years, and I think it's a great place to work. So I said, fine. I filled it out. I heard nothing for several months, probably 6 months. And all of a sudden, I got this letter in the mail from the FCC, and I opened it up and looked at it, and it was travel orders to go to Los Angeles, move to Los Angeles. But nothing in there actually indicating that I had been hired, just travel orders to go to Los Angeles. So I called up, and they said, oh, yeah, nobody told you. The Los Angeles office wants you to come to work for them. And I said, well, no, nobody told me. Well, do you want the job? And I thought about it, and I said, yeah, I do. I'll take it. And so my wife and I packed up and moved to Los Angeles and started working in the field office there, and just thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a decision that it's one of those pivotal decisions in one's life, that it was the right decision at the time, and it was a decision that affected the rest of my life. So, yeah, it was by accident, sort of, that I got there, but I'm glad I did it.
And you were in the Los Angeles field office from what years?
Late 70 through 76, mid-76.
I'm sure that there's a number of hams listening to the podcast that probably took their amateur radio exam under your proctorship.
Undoubtedly true, because not only did I give exams in Los Angeles, we had Arizona as part of our territory. So I gave exams in Phoenix and Tucson, and we also gave exams in Bakersfield, California. So anybody that took exams in any of those places during those years, there's a reasonable chance that I gave them the exam. And if they took a commercial exam, no matter whether I gave the exam or not, there's a reasonable chance that my signature appears as the issuing officer on their license. I was quite involved in that, although that was really only one aspect of the job. But gave commercial radio telegraph, radio telephone, all the amateur exams. And one of the things that we had to do as an examiner is we had to know Morse code at 25 words per minute and pass it, our own test at 25 words per minute. So it required knowing Morse code and basically required, knowledge of the exams, the content and all. So presumably everybody that gave FCC exams was able to pass FCC exams.
Now, the San Diego office, was that handled by somebody else? I remember that there was an FCC office in San Diego.
Clarence Spillman was the engineer in charge of that office at the time, and he was, that's actually a sub-office of the LA office, so he reported to the engineer in charge in Los Angeles, who reported to the Field Operations Bureau in D.C.
Well, that's where I took my general class exam. We were worried about parking in Los Angeles at the time, if you can believe that, in 1973. Let's move on. I remember in the 80s when cellular telephony was beginning, and I was involved in the two-way radio industry at the time, and so therefore, I was following cellular telephony. And there was this idea that somehow cellular was going to be different than PCS, that for some reason these would be two different services. Maybe PCS was going to have handsets. But it's my understanding that in 1994 you were appointed by then the FCC chairman, Reed Hunt, to lead the FCC's task force on PCS issues. Now, what happened to PCS, and why don't we hear about it now?
Well, it's still there. It's just mostly a terminology thing. Technically, cellular radio operates in the 800 megahertz band, and PCS operates in the 2 gigahertz band, 1.8, 1.9, 2, now up in 5 gigahertz. But PCS was intended to do two things. It was intended to use higher frequencies where you could have more bandwidth, and it also was intended to provide, as a result, I should say, to provide more capacity for particularly data kinds of services. And so there's not a lot of difference between cellular and PCS. Primary differences being the frequencies upon which they operate and the bandwidth of the modulation technologies that are used. Cellular tended to be, at the time, basically traditional FM, whereas the PCS services were moving more towards a spread spectrum sort of technology. So, again, to the end user, there's probably not a lot of difference, and there's no reason that an end user should know any difference in terms of how they use the equipment. But from a technology standpoint, PCS, I would have to say, is like a more advanced cellular system.
Right. So I remember in the time, and I get it, I get the idea that in those days we were evolving out of VHF, UHF mobile telephone services that were quite elite. Rich people and business executives might have had those telephones. As you say, they were FM. And I remember the first cellular telephones that were marketed were also FM phones. So I got this idea, at least it seemed to me at the time, that it's possible that in those days people would have two wireless devices, one a cellular phone, and perhaps as PCS evolved, that would be like a data handset if we were even thinking in those terms at that time. Was the FCC under your task force, were you guys thinking in those terms at the time that possibly there could be something like an iPhone, a computer that people carry in their hand?
Yes, absolutely. That was the idea, to even begin providing video services, which seemed almost impossible to think about it, but that was the idea, to provide advanced services like that. And in fact, we held hearings to talk about what PCS could provide. And I will never forget that one of the people who appeared before us in the hearing, said, this is going to evolve into something that ultimately is going to be implanted, and you won't even be carrying a device. And that's always hit me as that we're not there yet, but it seems like as things progress, we're getting more and more to the point of where devices are becoming very much in tune with human activity. And I think back to, I wonder if there will be a day when we don't really talk about devices anymore. We just we think about communicating, and the device takes over automatically and connects us. And that's where he was headed. I don't know. I'm still a skeptic on that, but it's certainly a vision that is interesting to think about.
Probably the reason we don't think or hear about PCS now is that all of these lines have blurred, and so we now carry one device. I think with the recapturing of analog television channels, that created some vast open spaces for these data networks as well. Yes,
definitely. The spectrum is definitely becoming more available for these kinds of services as a result of the repacking of TV. Though the services are also becoming more efficient. They're able to get more and more data into a particular bandwidth. And so you've got both things happening, the FCC making more spectrum available and the technology being more efficient in transmission of information. So you take the two, and we've come to a point where we can get a whole lot of data over a relatively small amount of spectrum anymore.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. I think the first computer I ever programmed was an IBM 370, and that took an entire floor of a building at school. And now I think I'm carrying in my pocket probably 100 buildings of IBM 370s. It's really quite amazing.
It is. I go back to my college days, and to program a computer, we had to sit down at a key punch machine and punch a deck of cards, and then take them to the computer center, hand them in. They would run them overnight, and we get the results back the next day. Think about that to where we are now, where you sit down in front of a computer and everything is instantaneous. It's been a tremendous change.
Let me take a quick break to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, and that's the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Jeremy, KF7IJZ, and it now includes Michael Walker, VA3MW, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. The group documents their projects and makes circuit boards available to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Jeremy may complain about the overall length of the podcast, but friends, let me tell you that I could listen to it all day, and that's good. Even if you are a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George, Jeremy, and Mike now for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast on every podcast player. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. You're a little bit older than I am, but I also started on cards, but we could get ours processed in the time it would take to go buy coffee and drink it. Then you go back and you get your report, right, and you look and you'd see that you had a syntax error on card number 50. And so then you'd have to do the whole project over. Fix the card, push the deck back in, and then go get another cup of coffee.
It made me learn to hate computers early on.
That's exactly what happened to me. There wasn't instant gratification in those days. And the people that stayed in computing, God bless them, because it's why we're where we're at now, but I think I was an early dropout to computing because of the time it took to get a reply.
Exactly, and I was very resistant on getting involved in computers again. I really didn't want to do it, and ultimately I had to, and things had changed a lot by then, and it was a lot more user-friendly, which was okay, although I still find them pretty frustrating when they don't work. and you have to troubleshoot what's wrong. But that being said, I don't see how we would get along in this today's environment without them.
How did your role at the FCC, how did that evolve after that?
When I left Los Angeles in '76, I went to D.C., and my first job for a couple of years was in the inspections branch, where all the field offices, in the investigations branch, all the field offices would send their investigations, usually interference or unlicensed activity, and we would review the reports that came in and decide if there should be a fine or what action should be taken, or if the case was resolved and should just be closed. And then I moved from that to chief of the monitoring station network. We had, in that time, 13 monitoring stations around the country, one of them in Puerto Rico, one in Hawaii. And I was in charge of that for a couple of years. Then 1980, I went to the FCC's laboratory in Columbia, Maryland, and I was in charge of research at the FCC for 3 years. 83, I went back to D.C., and I worked in the Policy and Rules Division of the Broadcast Bureau. And then from that, in 86, I went to the Private Radio Bureau and spent the rest of my career there, and ultimately as chief of that bureau. And that is the bureau that licenses almost everything that's non-broadcast, non-cable, and non-common carrier, which means police, fire, amateur, boats, aircraft, anything that, think of the two-way services, and basically it licensed all of the two-way kinds of services.
Now, were FCC monitoring stations in those days manned by human beings, or were those like remote monitoring?
They were all staffed 24 hours a day.
I remember that there was one in Southern California, right? Maybe in Santa Ana or in Orange County somewhere?
Santa Ana, you're right.
Those are very interesting places. How do they do it now? Is there FCC monitoring stations around the country still?
I'm not an expert in what they're actually doing now. I believe that some of those stations remain open and they're operated by remote control. And to the extent that they still have field offices, I believe the field offices have at least VHF, UHF direction finding capability, and some remote locations that they either dial into or can access through the internet. But I'm not directly involved with that, and I don't really know what the current configuration is, but I think it's something similar to what I just described.
When you were running the Private Radio Bureau, how important were amateur radio official observers to helping you keep at least the amateur radio portion of it clean?
I didn't really ever have any direct interaction, and so I can't really give you an answer to that question. I certainly was aware they were out there. I knew that they were doing a job to help keep the amateur radio service in check, but I never really received reports from the ARRL on how many people they would send notices to and all. I knew they were there, and I knew they were doing good, but I couldn't quantify it in any way.
Can you recall any major enforcements against an amateur radio operator during your tenure there at the FCC that perhaps is quite memorable to you?
I really don't want to go into specific cases, but I would say the majority of issues that became problematic were with amateurs who were intent on causing interference. For one reason or another, they were either just cantankerous or they would get upset with somebody else, and trying to find and resolve interference issues was a problem. Some amateurs also would get involved in setting up unlicensed broadcast stations, and so we'd wind up having to find those stations and close them down and then take action against their amateur radio license. But that was primarily it, interference issues. And occasionally we would find somebody operating illegally in some way, overpower. That tended not to be a great problem in the amateur service. That was much more a problem in the citizens band service, where they were limited to 5 watts, and our people would go in and find them running 300 or 1,000. So really, most of the enforcement was much more on the citizens band side than the amateur side.
In the end, did the FCC ever create some spectrum for would-be broadcasters? I remember pirate broadcasters in Southern California. I was never one, but I knew some. It seemed to me that there was this compulsion to play records on the air. They couldn't help it. Did the FCC ever make some kind of spectrum available for this?
Yes and no. Under Part 15 of the FCC rules, which is the part that that regulates all of the unlicensed activity, there are provisions for low-power broadcast stations, both in the AM band and the FM band. And there are limits on power and limits on antenna length. If someone complies with those requirements, they can put a station on the air, but it doesn't have a particularly long range. So, yes, there is a provision whereby you can do it, but you can't serve a whole town with it.
Are you still with the FCC now, or are you retired? What's your current status?
I left the FCC in 1996, and I became a consultant primarily in the land mobile services, police, fire, emergency, medical, and the business radio services and taxi cabs, helping people design radio systems and get licensed by the FCC. And did that till 2012, at which time I took a position in frequency coordination. The FCC certifies frequency coordinators in the various public safety and business radio services. And I started working for the Forestry Conservation Communications Association, which is one of the certified public safety coordinators. And I continue to do that now, although I'm just part-time now. I'm general manager of that operation, but I've gone to part-time. I'm basically about 90% retired today, but I have not been with the FCC for 20-some years.
Ralph, in 2009, you received the Barry Goldwater Amateur Radio Award for unique contributions in the field of amateur radio. What are those unique contributions that you made to the field of amateur radio?
Well, I was very honored to receive that award. I had the great opportunity to meet Barry Goldwater since he was from Arizona, and that was part of our district when I was in the field office. But I was very honored to receive the award, and there were perhaps a number of things that went into it. It's more like a lifetime achievement award, I guess. But some of the specific things that at least I'm proud of is I implemented the vanity call sign system while I was chief of the Private Radio Bureau. I also was instrumental in the first volunteer amateur exams at Dayton, Ohio. We worked with the local radio club, and we actually went out there, gave the exams to the volunteers, let them give the exams, and we sort of monitored the whole thing. And from that proceeded into the volunteer exam program that we have in place today. I was also instrumental in getting frequency coordination for amateur repeaters as part of the VHF, UHF operations for amateur radio, which at one point there were a lot of repeater wars, people saying this is my frequency and somebody else saying it's my frequency, and getting frequency coordination into amateur radio, I think, was a big step forward. And I also felt that the Morse code requirement had kind of become obsolete, and so started the process of reducing and eliminating Morse code requirements to become an amateur. So those are all sort of things that I hope went into the Barry Goldwater Award. They never tell you for sure, but I think those are some of the things that have had a pretty big impact on amateur radio, and I think a positive impact on amateur radio, both in letting people get their own call signs and in also encouraging people to come in. I think Morse code was a big detriment for a while to people coming into to be amateurs. So those are some of the things, at least, that I've done over my career that I think are important to amateur radio.
Well, you know, what's interesting about the loss of the Morse code requirement, I actually think it was a good idea, but it appears to be now that there's a higher percentage of amateur radio operators who are now operating Morse code than there was before.
I think that's kind of a funny thing, actually. When you're required, I think it's human nature. When you're required to do something, you resist it. But when you're allowed to do it, if you want to, you're more inclined to do it. And I think that may be just something related to human nature.
I have a theory on it. I've interviewed a lot of hams. Your episode is 328, and so I've interviewed a lot of hams who operate Morse code and continue to operate Morse code or have gone to Morse code. And I think that part of the idea that they want to do this now is because I think we're so inundated with visual and audible information that just sitting down for an hour and having a conversation on CW, there's some kind of zen about it, some kind of meditation that goes with that, that's kind of a break from the routine where we're just completely bombarded all day long with news and information and noise and everything. What do you think about that?
I think you've hit on something, because when you're operating on Morse code, it requires a full commitment. And there are a few people that can operate a key and listen to what's coming over the air and still talk to somebody in the room. I know one of them who I was always amazed could do it. But for most of us, if you're on Morse code, it's a full-time commitment to carry on that conversation, and completely blanks your mind of all the other stuff. And I think it can be a very relaxing activity.
There should be another book at some point. I'm sure someone will write it, like Zen and the Art of CW Operation.
I like it.
What's the current rig?
The current one is pretty small. I just have an ICOM mobile, a dual band 2-meter 440 unit in the car, and use it when I'm in the car. I don't actually have anything set up at the house. I'm in a deed-restricted community, and that limits what I can actually do here. So I'm sort of more content with just the mobile operation and not particularly active on the air these days, I have to admit.
What's the First Responder Network Authority, or FirstNet, and what's your role in it?
I don't have any specific role in it. It is a network that uses spectrum that was provided by the FCC. It is a network that is managed by the federal government, the National Information and Telecommunications Association, NTIA, part of the Department of Commerce. It is a broadband nationwide network for first responders, and the only thing that I have to do with it at all is I'm also chairman of the National Public Safety Telecommunications Council, which is a group of public safety trade associations. It's an informal federation of these that come together and help to develop standards for public safety communications, both technical and operational. And to that extent, that organization has provided quite a lot of input into the development of FirstNet, again, both in terms of technical operation and in terms of the policies, how the network gets implemented. It's strictly advisory. It's not a part of FirstNet. It's strictly advisory to FirstNet, which FirstNet can choose to follow or not.
Is FirstNet actually deployed across America? I mean, is there really a nationwide network?
There is. The FirstNet issued a contract to AT&T to build the network, and AT&T has built out the network nationwide, although there are still major gaps where it's not available. Interestingly, the area where I live, AT&T service is basically non-existent, but it's still a work in progress, and they are going to build it out, and it is going to serve the first responders nationwide, but it's not totally built out yet, but there's certainly a lot of it that is built out across the country.
Does that mean that there are FirstNet handsets that are used on this network?
There are. I can't get too deeply into this because I'm truly not involved in FirstNet. So I can't really talk in terms of specific equipment and all. There's supposed to be a variety of equipment that meets the common air interface requirements of the FirstNet system. But I cannot tell you what's actually out there that people are using, although I do know that the system is deployed and people are using it.
As a person who's involved in national public safety issues, do you think that public safety is missing its simple VHF, UHF channels?
Well, I think we have to step back and say, what is the function of FirstNet? FirstNet was intended to be a broadband data network deployed nationwide. It was never intended to replace the traditional land mobile VHF and UHF systems. Most of those are still in operation. A number of them are expanding because they are the last resort. Most of them are hardened. Not all of the FirstNet facilities are hardened, but most of the critical land mobile systems that are used by public safety are in sites that have backup generators. They're in bunkers, and they continue to operate under the worst of conditions. That is simply not true of the broadband networks. They may or may not continue to work in all situations. So to suggest that public safety has given up its VHF and UHF, I think, would be wrong. It continues to use those and 800 megahertz. And most localities would not be relying on the FirstNet network for their day-to-day voice dispatch kinds of communications at this point. Maybe they will someday, but not today.
Do you think that the sophisticated systems that public safety is now using across America and across the world, that they become so siloed that if there's a fire burning between two cities, they can't coordinate it because they're talking on different channels?
I like to think we're just the opposite of that. When 9/11 happened, there was a big concern that one department couldn't talk to another. It was interoperability was a big problem. And frankly, it wasn't a technical problem. It was more a problem of a human problem in that each entity really didn't want others to be able to listen to its conversations. And so we had a silo system that was very intense. 9/11 changed that to where more and more people, one, got on trunked systems in the 800 megahertz band that allowed everyone to communicate. And beyond that, even the VHF and UHF systems started putting in gateways so that one system could talk to another. And then FirstNet came along, which makes it possible for anybody that's on FirstNet anywhere in the country to communicate. And so I like to believe, and I really think it's true, that we have gone much more to a situation where every responder can talk to everyone else they need to.
Did 9/11 change the approach by public safety organizations away from channel exclusivity and privacy?
Well, what it did is it made everybody understand that communication between agencies is critical. And one of the big things that NIPSTIC has done is, one of the things that we found was people even had radios that could talk to each other, but they didn't know it because the channels didn't have the same names. And so one of the big things that I think NIPSTIC has contributed to interoperability is giving common channel names to all of the public safety channels so that if one entity wants to talk to another, if they have the same channel name in their radio, they can both get on that channel and talk. To not be able to talk because you don't know you have the same channel is just inexcusable. So, that's just one of the things that we've done that I think has really helped interoperability in this country.
Are amateur radio operators useful in emergency events?
Absolutely. And I encourage amateurs to work with their local emergency management offices to be part of the operation, because amateurs can also communicate when other systems are down, and they can provide essential backup communications. It's not police dispatch, but it's providing information in an emergency back to an emergency operations center that's needed and necessary. So I really encourage amateurs to work with their emergency management agencies as much as possible to be part of that team. It's a little harder, I think, to get that expertise out to the general public, but if you're in an area and you've worked with community leaders to say, hey, we're a resource, we're here if you need us, that's another way that amateurs can get involved.
When you speak to amateur radio groups, what perspective would you bring to the amateur radio community that should be heard?
I think I try to have a theme that amateur radio can be lots of things to lots of people, and if you want to get involved in amateur radio, you should take advantage of all of that. And whether it is improving your technical skills, improving your communication skills, improving your public service skills, any of those things, amateur radio provides an outlet that you can do that. It's an outlet that allows people to learn, it allows people to grow, and it allows interaction with others that have similar interests. So my basic theme is that amateur radio has not outlived its usefulness. It's different than it was 50 years ago or 20 years ago. It involves other technologies like the Internet today. But it's still an opportunity for people with a technical knowledge, desire of technical knowledge, to be able to get together with others to learn and to mentor. So I guess that's primarily what I talk about, other than talking about my experiences at the FCC. The theme that I want people to understand is amateur radio is still viable. It's still a very wonderful way to expands one's horizon.
Ralph, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this. Time has gone by very fast for me. I hope it will for your listeners as well. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my experiences with your listeners. So thank you.
73. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Ralph. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put an N4RH in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page or in the middle of the show notes page for upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo items. I'm updating it as I have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.